"You don't belong here. Old man. This is for real veterans," barked the security guard, the frail, elderly man in a faded jacket. Minutes later, heavy boots echoed through marble halls as a four-star general stormed in. "Where's the man you just humiliated?" Richard "Rick" Miller had marked this date on his calendar months ago, circling it with trembling fingers. November 11th, Veterans Day, when the National Military History Museum would host its annual tribute to Vietnam veterans. At 75, Rick looked much older than his years, his once sturdy frame now bent with age, his face deeply lined like weathered leather. Rick no longer drove. His eyesight had dimmed, his hands shook with persistent tremor, and his steps had slowed to a careful shuffle. But his memory remained sharp, especially the years he'd spent in uniform. Vietnam in '68, Desert Storm in '91. Places and dates etched into his soul more permanently than the scars on his body. The journey from his small apartment required 2 different bus routes, timed with military precision. Rick rose before dawn, giving himself ample time to wash and dress with care. His clothes were simple but dignified. Faded jeans, a clean but worn button-up shirt, and his treasured army jacket that hung loosely on his thin frame. The silver star metal pin to his chest caught the morning light as he inspected his reflection in the small bathroom mirror. His daughter had offered to drive him. "Dad, please let me take you," she'd insisted. But Rick had gently declined. "You got work, sweetie. I've been managing on my own since before you were born." In truth, he preferred making this journey alone. Some pilgrimages were meant to be solitary. Rick's sparse white hair was neatly combed, his face cleanly shaved. Despite his humble appearance and frail physique, there was still something in his posture. The way he held his shoulders, the steady gaze in his faded blue eyes, that spoke of the soldier he had once been and in many ways still was. The December air bit through Rick's thin frame as he arrived at the museum's grand entrance. Marble steps rose to impressive columns, and banners proclaimed honoring Vietnam heroes. A special tribute. American flags fluttered in the cold breeze, and a red carpet stretched from the street to the entrance doors. Rick paused at the bottom of the steps, catching his breath. His old bones protested against the cold, but he straightened his back as best he could, clutching a carefully folded flag close to his chest. This flag had draped the coffin of his best friend, Sergeant Thomas Walsh, killed in action in the Mekong Delta. Rick had promised Tom's widow he would honor his memory every Veterans Day. Ahead of him, a steady stream of visitors moved up the steps. Families chatted excitedly, many accompanying veterans in crisp uniforms or branded veteran gear. Rick noticed how easily they ascended the steps, how confidently they presented themselves at the entrance. Several younger veterans moved smoothly through, each presenting military ID or VA cards and receiving respectful nods from the security staff. A school group passed him, the teacher pointing out exhibits visible through the glass doors. "Today you'll see real heroes," she told her students. A few children glanced curiously at Rick, then quickly looked away, perhaps uncomfortable with his aged appearance. Gathering his strength, Rick joined the line of visitors. He felt oddly out of place among the well-dressed crowds, aware of his simple clothes and weathered appearance. Still, he reminded himself, he had as much right to be here as anyone. More, perhaps. The museum was supposed to honor men like him, who had served when called, regardless of how time had treated them since. Finally, Rick reached the front of the line, facing a young security guard with a close-cropped haircut and bored expression. "Good morning," Rick offered a smile, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age. "Beautiful day for remembering, isn't it?" The guard barely looked up. "ID?" he asked curtly. Rick's smile didn't falter. "I served in Vietnam, son, 5th Special Forces Group, then later in Desert Storm with the 82nd Airborne." The guard finally looked up, quickly scanning Rick's weathered face, trembling hands, and faded jacket with a single silver star. "Sir, we need proper identification. Military ID, VA card, or discharge papers. We can't just let anyone claim they're a vet." "I haven't had an ID in years," Rick explained patiently. "But I did bring this." He carefully removed a preserved photograph from his inside pocket. Himself as a young soldier standing beside a Special Forces unit in Vietnam, jungle backdrop behind their serious faces. The guard barely glanced at it. That could be anyone. No ID, no entry. Those are the rules. A woman in an expensive coat behind Rick muttered, "So sad." Always some homeless guy trying to sneak in for the free coffee and heat. A few others in line chuckled. Rick felt his cheeks burn, but maintained his dignity. He wasn't homeless, just old and not wealthy enough for fancy clothes. "Sir, you need to move along," the guard gestured. "There are people waiting." "Son, this flag was given to me at my best friend's funeral," Rick said quietly, holding up the folded triangle. "He died saving 3 men in the Mekong. I promised his widow I'd bring it today." "Rules are rules, sir," the guard said, already looking past him to the next person in line. Rick didn't argue. Decades of military discipline had taught him when a battle couldn't be won. Pride kept his back as straight as his aged spine allowed as he turned away. No scene, no protest, just quiet dignity as he descended the steps, the wind cutting through his jacket more sharply now. The folded flag he carried. He clutched tighter to his chest, protecting it from more than just the cold. Inside the museum, the ceremony proceeded with polished perfection. The director, a man who had never served himself, gave an eloquent speech about sacrifice and duty. A children's choir sang patriotic songs beneath a massive American flag. On large screens around the hall, a video showed young, photogenic veterans speaking about their experiences, intercut with historical footage of Vietnam. "Today we honor those who stood in harm's way," the director proclaimed to enthusiastic applause. "Those brave men and women who put service above self." Meanwhile, outside, Rick sat on a cold bench waiting for the next bus, which wouldn't arrive for another hour. The flag remained clutched in his weathered hands, a connection to a friend who never made a home, to comrades who existed now only in his memories. The irony wasn't lost on him. Inside those walls, people cheered for an idea of veterans. Clean, heroic, conveniently packaged for civilian consumption, while he, with his worn clothes and unsteady hands, was deemed too untidy, too real for their celebration. He'd seen it before, the way America loved its warriors in theory but often overlooked them in practice. The way people thank him for his service while averting their eyes from his struggling peers on street corners. It didn't anger him anymore. Disappointment had long ago hardened into quiet resignation. Rick glanced back at the museum, its flags and banners fluttering in the cold wind. He wondered how many others like him had been turned away today. Old soldiers whose IDs had expired with their youth, whose battle scars had faded along with public memory of the conflicts they fought in. Inside, they spoke of heroes. Outside sat the real thing, unrecognized and unwelcome. Across the street, Lieutenant Colonel Melissa Ramirez had watched the entire scene unfold. A West Point graduate with 18 years of service, Ramirez was not someone who tolerated injustice, particularly involving veterans. She had come to the museum in civilian clothes, intending to quietly observe the ceremony before meeting colleagues for lunch. What she had witnessed instead made her blood boil. The dismissal of the elderly veteran had been conducted with casual cruelty, without even the pretense of respect or assistance. Ramirez pulled out her phone and made a call, walking briskly away from the museum as she spoke. "General Reed's office. Please, tell him it's urgent." She kept her eyes on the elderly veteran sitting alone on the bench. Within moments, she was connected. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez, there's a situation at the National Military History Museum I thought you should know about." General Marcus Reed listened intently on the other end. At 62, Reed was a living legend in military circles. Decorated combat veteran, respected strategist, and fierce advocate for those who served under him. "What kind of situation, Colonel?" "I just witnessed a veteran being denied entry to today's ceremony. Elderly man, Vietnam and Desert Storm era by his jacket insignia. Silver Star recipient. Security turned him away for lack of ID." Ramirez provided the details efficiently. The old soldier's dignity, the guard's dismissal, the bystander's mockery. She knew the general well enough to recognize the controlled fury that would be building. "There's more, sir," she added. "I heard him give his name." Richard Miller, 5th Special Forces in Vietnam. The line went silent for a moment. Miller? Richard Miller from the 5th? General Reed's voice had changed, tension evident in every syllable. You're certain? Yes, sir. He mentioned the Mekong Delta and later service in Desert Storm. Reed's office suddenly erupted into activity as he barked orders to his staff. Clear my schedule. Have my vehicle ready in 2 minutes. Sir, his aide asked, confused by the sudden urgency. Should I notify the museum director that you're coming? No, Reed replied, his voice dangerously calm as he put on his dress uniform jacket. This will be an unannounced visit. Within minutes, a convoy of black government SUVs was speeding toward the museum, lights flashing but sirens silent. Inside the lead vehicle, General Reed sat ramrod straight, his face set in grim determination. Captain Wilson was with me in Desert Storm, Reed explained to Ramirez, who had joined him in the vehicle. He told me about a Special Forces operative named Richard Miller who saved his entire unit in Vietnam. Pulled out 8 men under heavy fire after their position was overrun. The same man later served as a master sergeant training troops for Desert Storm. Wilson said he owed his life to Miller's training. The convoy pulled up the museum entrance with military precision, visitors turning in surprise as General Reed emerged. Inside the museum, the ceremony was in full swing. The same security guard who had turned Rick away was still checking IDs, maintaining his arbitrary barrier between those deemed worthy and those who were not. He looked up as heavy boots approached, his eyes widening at the sight of a 4-star general bearing down on him, flanked by staff officers. The guard straightened immediately. Sir, welcome to... Where is he? Reed's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. I'm sorry, sir. The veteran you turned away. Where is he? The general's tone left no room for evasion. The guard swallowed hard, suddenly aware that something had gone very wrong. There was an elderly man without proper ID, but... You don't belong here, old man. This is for real veterans, General Reed quoted, his voice carrying across the marble foyer. That's what you said to him, isn't it? The museum director, alerted by the commotion, hurried over. General Reed, what an honor. Is there a problem? Reed turned to the director, his voice dangerously calm. The problem is that while you're giving speeches about honoring veterans, you have staff turning away actual heroes at the door. The gathered crowd fell silent. Reporters, sensing a better story unfolding than the planned ceremony, moved closer, cameras ready. Where's the man you just humiliated? Reed demanded. The museum director paled, looking between the imposing general and his suddenly nervous security guard. There must be some misunderstanding. We welcome all veterans with proper identification. Proper identification? General Reed repeated, the words sharp with contempt. Tell me, have you ever seen what happens to military IDs after 30 years? They yellow, they crack, they fall apart just like the bodies of the men who carried them through hell. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying throughout the marble hall. You had a Silver Star recipient standing on your steps, and you locked the door in his face. A collective gasp rippled through the visitors. Phone cameras rose, capturing the moment. Richard Miller, the general continued, saved countless lives in Vietnam and trained hundreds of soldiers who survived Desert Storm because of his instruction. My own executive officer credits Miller with teaching him skills that kept him alive in combat. The director's face had gone from pale to ashen. General, I had no idea. Of course you had no idea, Reed cut him off, because you reduced honoring veterans to a photo opportunity, to speeches and banners and convenient heroes who fit your image of what service should look like. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez approached, speaking quietly into the general's ear. He nodded once, then addressed a junior officer. Find Mr. Miller immediately. The museum had fallen completely silent. The ceremony in the main hall had unofficially paused as word spread about the confrontation. Visitors and staff stood frozen, many sharing looks of discomfort and shame. Outside, across the plaza, Rick still sat on the bench dusted with light snow, still clutching the folded flag. Rick looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps. crisp, measured steps that he recognized immediately as military. A young officer in dress uniform stopped before him, rendering a perfect salute. "Mr. Miller? General Reed requests your presence, sir." Rick blinked in surprise. "General Reed?" "Yes, sir. If you'll come with me, please." Confused but intrigued, Rick allowed the officer to help him to his feet. As they crossed the plaza, he noticed the black vehicles at the entrance, the small crowd forming outside. At the top of the steps stood a figure in full dress uniform, for stars gleaming on each shoulder. As Rick approached, the general stepped forward and rendered a sharp, formal salute. "Master Sergeant Miller," General Reed said, using Rick's highest rank. "I'm Marcus Reed. My executive officer was Captain James Wilson, 82nd Airborne. You trained him before Desert Storm." Rick's eyes widened in recognition. "Young Jimmy Wilson? Good soldier, quick learner. He says he owes his life to your training, sir." Around them, a crowd had gathered, museum staff, visitors, reporters, and the officers who had accompanied General Reed. One by one, the military personnel present came to attention and saluted. Then civilians began to show their respect as well, some placing hands over hearts, others bowing heads in recognition. For the first time in decades, Richard Miller stood at his full height, shoulders back, not just an old man in a worn jacket, but a soldier being recognized for who he truly was. "We've got some unfinished business inside, Sergeant," General Reed said, offering his arm for support. "There's a ceremony honoring veterans, and it's missing its guest of honor." By the following morning, the story had gone viral. Cell phone videos of General Reed's confrontation circulated widely, as did images of Richard Miller being escorted into the ceremony as its most honored guest. Major news networks picked up the story, finding in it a powerful narrative about recognition, respect, and the often invisible veterans in our midst. The museum director resigned within 48 hours, citing personal reasons but fooling no one. The security guard was reassigned after issuing a public apology. More significantly, the museum's board announced a complete overhaul of their veteran access policies. Their statement read, "All self-identified veterans will be welcomed with respect and dignity. Our staff will receive specialized training in recognizing and honoring military service in all its forms, not just through IDs and papers, but through understanding and compassion." Richard Miller found himself reluctantly in the spotlight. Interview requests poured in, which he mostly declined. "I'm not the story," he insisted. "There are thousands like me, just less visible." Nevertheless, his quiet dignity struck a chord nationwide. Veterans organizations reported a surge in public support. Retirement homes noted increased volunteer applications. Schools requested veteran speakers for special assemblies. The museum itself dedicated an entire new wing to the Forgotten Warriors, honoring veterans often overlooked because of age, appearance, or circumstance. Rick was invited to cut the ribbon at its opening, which he did with characteristic humility. The incident sparked a national conversation about how America treats its aging veterans, not just in words, but in meaningful actions. Most meaningful to Rick was the bench, a simple wooden seat installed near the museum entrance, bearing a small bronze plaque, reserved for those who served. It became an unspoken tradition that no one, regardless of status, would sit there if a veteran was standing nearby. Every Sunday afternoon, weather permitting, Rick could be found near that bench, sometimes sitting quietly, other times sharing stories with younger veterans or curious children, not as a homeless-looking old man, but as a living link to history, a keeper of memories that might otherwise be lost. The flag that had once belonged to his fallen friend found a permanent home in the museum's new wing, displayed alongside a photograph of both men in their youth, and a simple statement about friendship and sacrifice that transcended time. And across the city, in silent salutes, in small acts of recognition, an important lesson spread. You never know the battle someone has fought just by looking at them. True respect means looking beyond the surface to honor the service within. For Rick, the most powerful moments came when young soldiers would approach him, render a proper salute, and simply say, "Thank you for blazing the trail, sir." In those moments, the years fell away, and he was once again the strong young man who had answered his country's call. If you believe no veteran should ever be judged by their appearance rather than their service, comment respect below. Because true honor isn't shown in ceremonies. It's demonstrated in how we treat every veteran every day. Subscribe to Veteran Stories. If you believe every soldier's sacrifice deserves to be remembered, regardless of how time has treated them since.